Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Hilliard at Home. Today we're talking about drafting a literary analysis paper. Now, this video assumes that you've already watched the video on planning a literary analysis paper, so if you haven't, you should probably stop now and view that one first. You should be able to find links to it in e-courses and at the end of this video. The planning video walks you through the process of identifying key information from your primary and secondary sources, identifying key analytical tasks, and arranging those analytical tasks using the simple to complex model. In short, that video is designed to help you build the skeleton, or the underlying structure, of a good literary analysis paper. In this video, we're talking about how to put some flesh onto that skeleton. But we're not yet talking about dressing and beautifying that flesh. That's what we do during the process of revising and proofreading. Oh yeah, there's a handsome guy. Seriously though, drafting is about getting the ideas on the page, and if we're too worried about beautifying, then we're just going to end up with writer's block. Now, if you're giving your draft to someone else to review, then yes, you want to do at least a little revising and proofreading to make sure that it's presentable. But generally speaking, we want to save any kind of detailed review for after we've completed the first draft and maybe received some feedback from others on it. Now, since drafting comes after planning, you should already have a pretty good idea of what your key analytical tasks are and how they'll be arranged. Again, if you don't know what analytical tasks are, go back and watch the video on planning. You should also have a working thesis, which is a one-sentence statement of what you think your final argument will be. But keep in mind that things can change as you draft. You might reconsider or rearrange your analytical tasks, and you might change your working thesis. And these things might change again when you revise. That's fine. The point is that your outline and working thesis are tools to help you draft, but you shouldn't feel restricted by them. If you find yourself going in a somewhat different direction than you originally planned, go for it. Just make sure that you're actually rethinking your plan rather than just rambling. Okay, so the basic building blocks of any paper are the body paragraphs. Introductions and conclusions are also really important, but there's a separate video on those types of paragraphs, so here we're going to focus on what makes a good body paragraph. There are 4 key qualities that all good body paragraphs share. They're fully developed, they have a coherent structure, they're cohesive, and they have good transitions. So let's start with what it means for a paragraph to be fully developed. Remember that every paragraph in a literary analysis paper should develop one clear point of analysis. This means that through your own original commentary, you're revealing something that is not immediately obvious about the literature. You might, for instance, be explaining the meaning of an important metaphor or symbol that's used in the literary work. Or you might be explaining the full significance of an important piece of dialogue or an important aspect of the setting. You might be demonstrating an important connection between the text and its historical context. There are many different types of analytical tasks that you might be performing within your literary analysis paper. Too many for us to review here. Once again, if you're not sure that you understand the concept of an analytical task, then you should probably review the video on planning a literary analysis paper where that concept is explained in depth. Now, any analytical task is developed through the presentation of relevant evidence and analytical commentary on that evidence. When writing a work of literary analysis, evidence can include textual information, contextual information, and commentary by other scholars. Textual evidence is just details from the text that you're examining, or maybe details from another text that you're comparing it with or contrasting it to. Contextual information is information about the place and time in which the text was written. Commentary by other scholars includes any analysis of or arguments about the text or its context made by other scholars within academic publications. If you're not sure what an academic publication is, be sure to review the Hilliard at Home video on academic sources. So paragraph development has a lot to do with making sure that you have good information within your paragraph, but no paragraph should function just as an information dump. In other words, you should never have a paragraph that only delivers textual or contextual information, or that only summarizes someone else's scholarship. You should always be providing these types of evidence in order to give your own original analytical commentary on them. So let's look at an example of a good body paragraph to see how this works. This paragraph is from a student paper on a novel called Herland, written in 1915 by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It's a feminist novel that imagines a utopian community populated entirely by women who are able to reproduce without men. Remember, this is a body paragraph, so we're kind of coming in the middle of things, but we should be able to see how it uses textual and contextual information to make an important point about the novel that wouldn't be obvious to the casual reader. So, we're going to read through the paragraph sentence by sentence and identify the textual information, which we'll highlight in blue, the contextual information, which we'll highlight in green, and the analytical commentary, which we'll highlight in yellow, so that we can see how the paragraph is fully developed with these three elements. Let's start. On its surface, Gilman's novel provides an inspiring vision of a society that is not corrupted by the influence of patriarchy. But a closer look indicates that this vision is intertwined with the disturbing history of racist eugenics. Okay, so this is a really nice topic sentence, and we'll talk more about its function as a topic sentence in just a moment when we talk about paragraph structure. But for now, let's just notice that it introduces a key analytical point about Gilman's novel, the fact that there is a racist element hidden beneath its surface. Now, when I say an analytical point, I mean that it's something that's not obvious about the text, something that the author of this paper, let's call her Jada, has discovered through her own process of close reading and research. In other words, it's an understanding of the text that we wouldn't necessarily get just from casually reading it ourselves. Okay, let's read the next two sentences. Eugenics refers to any effort to scientifically manage reproduction within a population, and throughout the 20th century, it was often connected with efforts to enforce racial purity within a society. The most notorious eugenics program, of course, was developed in Germany in the 1930s, when the Nazi regime sought to create a nation of pure Aryan blood. So, these two sentences introduce important contextual information that is not within the text itself, but that is about the context in which the text was written. We learn what eugenics is, and that it was common during the time period that Gilman wrote her novel. We also learn about its connection to racism. What we don't know yet is why Jada would connect this contextual information to Gilman's novel. We haven't seen a connection between this contextual information and any textual information. Let's keep reading. Though Gilman's novel was published in 1915, before the rise of Nazism, it directly invokes the same notion of racial purity when Van, the narrator, describes the women of Herland. There is no doubt in my mind that these people were of Aryan stock and were once in contact with the best civilizations of the Old World. Okay, now we start to see the connection that Jada is making. She provides textual evidence, a direct quote from the novel, that seems to connect it to the racism of the Nazi ideology through that term, Aryan. But that's a pretty thin connection so far. Just the use of the word Aryan doesn't mean that the novel's whole vision is based on a racist ideology. If Jada's going to convince us of that, she's going to have to develop that point with more textual evidence and commentary. Let's see if that's what happens. This reference to Aryan stock suggests that white racial purity is an important component of Gilman's utopian vision, especially when we notice how carefully the women of Herland control the process of reproduction within their society. Okay, here Jada is providing analytical commentary. She is interpreting the textual evidence that she just provided, partly by connecting it to another observation about the text, the observation that the women of Herland control the process of reproduction within their society. But do they control reproduction? It's not enough just to say that they do. We need some textual evidence to support that assertion. Let's see if Jada delivers. They restrict reproduction to only a select few women, those deemed most virtuous, in an effort to ensure that only the most desirable traits are passed from generation to generation. Okay, this isn't a direct quote from the text, but it's a nice brief summary of important information from the text, and that information directly supports the assertion that the women of Herland closely control the process of reproduction in their society. In other words, they practice eugenics. Let's keep reading. In addition to this, the women of Herland guard themselves against contamination from the savages of the surrounding area. suggesting that any kind of racial mixing with those outside their boundaries would compromise the moral and intellectual qualities that they have cultivated through their breeding program. Here we get more textual evidence as well as analytical commentary that connects that evidence to the idea that the women of Herland practice racist eugenics. Okay, so by this point, we should be able to see from our highlighting that Jada's paragraph uses a strong mix of textual evidence, contextual evidence, and analytical commentary to fully develop a complex point that we can find fully expressed in the analytical commentary of the final sentence of the paragraph. So while the defining characteristic of Herland is the absence of men and patriarchy, it's important to recognize that Gilman's utopian vision also includes extreme racial exclusion as one of its central elements. So the way that this final sentence gives full expression to the point that's developed through the course of the paragraph really leads us into our next discussion about coherent structure. But before we get into that, I want to make a quick point about paragraph development regarding paragraph length. Now, there's no definitive rule about how long a paragraph should be, but if you're writing a paragraph that's making a sufficiently important and complex point, and you're developing that point with relevant evidence, the paragraph should probably be at least 200 words, which is a little more than half a page if you've formatted your paper properly. But here's the thing. When a paragraph runs too much over 300 words, the reader can start to lose track of the main point that's being developed. So, generally speaking, a well-developed paragraph is somewhere in the range of 200 to 300 words. If your paragraph is below 200 words, you may not be making a complex enough or important enough point, or you may not be developing that point adequately. If your paragraph is running well over 300 words, you might be trying to do too much. You need to find a more succinct way to achieve that analytical task, or you need to figure out how to split that task into two smaller tasks. Jada's paragraph is 296 words, so she was right on the verge of having to worry about whether she was trying to do too much. Okay, let's talk about what it means for a paragraph to have a coherent structure. When we use the word coherent, we usually mean something like understandable, but coherent really just means unified. When something is unified, it's generally more easily understood than when it's not unified. When we see a fully and properly assembled car, for instance, we have a very clear idea of what we're looking at and what its purpose is. On the other hand, if we just saw the disassembled parts of a car scattered around a lawn, we might have trouble understanding what we're looking at, particularly if they're mixed together with things that are not part of that car. We might also be confused if we saw the parts of a car assembled, but in the wrong way. So when we talk about a paragraph with a coherent structure, we're talking about a paragraph in which the information and ideas are unified in an easily comprehensible way. Now, if we look back at how we highlighted Jada's paragraph, we should be able to recognize that it's a unified paragraph. It makes the point that Gilman's utopian vision has racist eugenics at its core, and everything within the paragraph contributes in a clear and important way to the development of that point. All of the textual information, all of the contextual information, and all of the commentary within the paragraph relates directly to that central point of the paragraph. Jada doesn't go off on a tangent about Nazi concentration camps, or about whether the so-called savages that are referenced in the novel are supposed to be African or South American or something else. Now, either of those discussions would be loosely connected to the other content within the paragraph, but neither of them would really contribute in a meaningful way to the development of the paragraph's core analytical task. They would be digressions, or fluff, that would take Jada and the reader off track. Another thing that we should be able to recognize here is that each block of information or commentary builds off of the previous material in the paragraph in a clear and logical way. After introducing the contextual information about eugenics, Jada provides textual information that clearly connects to that contextual information. And then she provides analytical commentary and more textual information that gives us a fuller and fuller understanding of that connection. We learn about how the women of Herland practice eugenics, and we learn about how this is connected to their racist fear of savage outsiders. Each part of the paragraph builds off of the previous parts to take us deeper into the analytical task of the paragraph. Now, two important parts of this coherent structure are the topic sentence and the concluding sentence. A well-structured paragraph generally begins with a topic sentence that gives the reader a basic idea of the analytical task that will be undertaken within the paragraph. Let's think about Jada's topic sentence. On its surface, Gilman's novel provides an inspiring vision of a society that is not corrupted by the influence of patriarchy, but a closer look indicates that this vision is intertwined with the disturbing history of racist eugenics. Now, as readers, when we read this sentence, we may not know what eugenics is, or how the novel contains racist elements, or how those racist elements are connected to the novel's feminism. It's not the job of the topic sentence to explain all these things to us, but it is the job of the topic sentence to prepare us for a paragraph that does explain these things to us. And this is important because it helps us process what we're reading in the paragraph while we read it. Even though the words eugenics and Germany are nowhere to be found in Gilman's novel, we're not disoriented when Jada starts defining eugenics and connecting it to the Nazi regime, because we already know that the paragraph is going to somehow connect these things to Gilman's feminist vision. And once all these connections are made within the paragraph, we get a nice concluding sentence that articulates for us the fully formed analytical point that the paragraph has developed. So the topic sentence and the concluding sentence operate like bookends for the paragraph. The topic sentence prepares us for the analytical task before we read it, and the concluding sentence makes sure that we're fully aware of the analytical task that we've just worked through. Okay, let's talk about paragraph cohesion. The word cohesion sounds a lot like coherence, and that's because they have the same root, and they're both about unity. But while coherence refers to a kind of overall unity, cohesion refers more specifically to how the parts actually connect to each other. A cohesive agent is something like glue that makes things stick together. So when we talk about cohesion within a paragraph, we're talking about the individual sentences connecting or sticking to each other nicely. Another word that we commonly use for cohesion is flow. When we say that someone's writing flows, what we usually mean is that as readers, we're able to move easily from part to part, from sentence to sentence. We never feel disoriented or lost while we read. Now, flow is one of those things that we all recognize when we see it, but might have a hard time saying exactly what it is or how to achieve it in our own writing. So, to get a better grip on what we mean when we say that someone's writing flows, let's think back to what we just said about the importance of a good topic sentence in a paragraph. We said that a good topic sentence helps us process what we're reading in the paragraph while we read it. This is the same thing that good cohesion does. It helps us process and understand what we're reading while we read it. When we say that someone's writing doesn't flow, we usually mean that we have to stop frequently and think back on what we just read to understand how it connects to the rest of the reading. We don't have to do this when the writing flows or has good cohesion. So, how do we achieve good cohesion in our own paragraphs? Well, we can do this by making sure that each sentence in the paragraph has a clear known-to-new progression. Now, every sentence introduces some new information or idea, right? If it didn't, there wouldn't really be any need for that sentence. But as readers, we need to be able to easily see how that new information is connected to the known information that we've already received. And we need to see that connection while reading the sentence, not after we've already read the whole sentence. Now, seeing this connection becomes much easier for us when the sentence begins with phrasing that clearly references known information and indicates the relationship between that known information and the new information that the sentence is going to present. And the clearer and more direct that reference is, the easier it will be for us to see and understand the connection as we read. Let's see how this works in Jada's body paragraph. The way that we check for known to new progression is that we look at the beginning of each sentence, let's say the first 7 or 8 words, to see if there's a clear reference back to known information. So let's look at that first part of Jada's second sentence. The first 2 words of that sentence, eugenics refers, give us a very direct reference back to the idea that is presented in the last portion of the previous sentence, that Gilman's utopian vision is intertwined with the disturbing history of racist eugenics. So right off the bat, we know that this next sentence is going to give us new information that will help us understand that history of racist eugenics. This is a very clear and direct reference back to known information. Now let's look at the beginning of the third sentence. The most notorious eugenics program, of course. The second sentence introduced the idea that eugenics has historically been connected with efforts to enforce racial purity. So the beginning of the third sentence indicates very clearly that it will tell us about one particularly notable example of such an effort. Again, the new information that's delivered within the sentence is introduced with a very clear reference back to known information. The reader knows what is coming and is fully prepared to make the necessary connections. Now, if we look at the beginning of the fourth sentence, the reference back to known information takes a little bit longer to develop, but the reader should still see pretty easily that the sentence will make the connection between Herland and Nazi ideology. Now let's imagine that this sentence began instead with the reference to the comment by Gilman's narrator. Van, the narrator of Gilman's novel, refers to the women of Herland as being of Aryan stock, which indicates that Gilman was invested in the same notions of white racial purity that would give rise to the Nazi Party more than a decade after Herland was published. This sentence would communicate the same idea as the sentence that Jada actually wrote, but as readers, we would have to wait until we were about 16 words into the sentence before we would start to see the connection to the previous information. And even then, the connection may not be entirely clear. Consequently, we would feel a bit disoriented while reading that sentence. Now, instead of going through all the rest of the sentences in depth, I'm going to just highlight the connections back to known information. With all these connections highlighted, we can see that Jada has done a good job of creating cohesion or flow by making sure that each of her sentences has a known to new progression. The new information or idea that each sentence delivers is introduced with a clear and direct reference back to known information. Before we move on, however, let me briefly comment on the beginning of the last sentence. In the previous two sentences, we were informed that the women of Herland restrict reproduction and that they guard themselves against contamination by savage outsiders. So the word "so" at the beginning of the final sentence tells us that we're about to get a conclusion drawn from these facts. And as we read that conclusion, we can see how it follows from the previous points. The point here is that these references back to known information don't need to be elaborate repetitions of previous phrases. They just need to clearly indicate the relationship between known information and the new information. Okay, so this discussion of cohesion brings us nicely to our discussion of the last important quality of a good paragraph, a good transition. Because good transitions between paragraphs work the same way as good transitions between the sentences within those paragraphs. Just as each sentence delivers some new information or idea, each paragraph develops some new analytical point. But it's important for the reader to be able to see from the beginning how that new analytical point is connected to the analytical points that came before. In other words, our topic sentences should also be transition sentences, and they should accomplish this with a clear reference back to previous analytical points. Let's look at how Jada achieves this in her paper. Okay, here's that last sentence of the paragraph we've been looking at. As we previously noted, this concluding paragraph gives us a nice, full articulation of the analytical point that Jada has developed within the paragraph. And that point, again, is that racist exclusion and eugenics are central components of Gilman's feminist utopian vision. Now let's look at the first sentence of the next paragraph. As Mary Ziegler demonstrates in her examination of eugenic feminism, Gilman was far from the only radical white feminist in the period who built her feminist platform around the idea of a racist eugenics program. Okay, I think it should be pretty clear how this sentence is doing the work of both a topic sentence and a transition sentence. As a topic sentence, it's telling us that the paragraph we're about to read will establish that the type of racist feminism that we see in Gilman's novel was part of a much larger movement. We're prepared to receive contextual evidence and probably scholarly source references that establish this connection between Gilman and other feminists of the time period. And as a transition sentence, it also makes it clear how this analytical task builds off of the previous one. Jada has established that Gilman's feminist vision has racism at its core. And now she is going to show us that the same vision was shared by many other prominent feminists of the time period. Now, notice that Jada achieves a strong transition without using clunky and forced phrases like, another important element of Gilman's novel, or, in addition to having a racist element to it, Gilman's novel also, or even worse, phrases like, secondly, or thirdly, or in conclusion. If you feel the need to use phrases like this, it's probably because there's not really a strong logical progression to your analytical tasks. Words like another or additionally indicate that you're just loosely stacking things together rather than really building off of previous points of analysis in order to take us into deeper realms of complexity. It's kind of like just saying, oh, and here's another thing that I'm going to talk about. And we just start over with a completely new point rather than building off of the previous point in a meaningful way. Now, if you are building rather than just stacking, if you're gradually building a more and more complex argument, then the transitions between your paragraphs should feel natural and organic, like Jada's, rather than forced and artificial. If we can do this, then we'll have nice cohesion not just within our paragraphs, but also between them. Okay, so just to quickly review. After we build the skeleton of our paper through the planning process, we want to start adding the flesh by drafting good paragraphs that are fully developed with relevant evidence and strong commentary, that have a nice unified structure with a logical progression and no digressions or fluff, that have good cohesion or flow between the sentences, and that connect clearly to each other as they gradually build a more and more complex argument. Okay, that wraps up this video. In a moment, you'll see links to other Hilliard at Home videos, but you should also be able to find links to those videos in eCourses. You should also check eCourses for any quizzes, discussion boards, or assignments related to this video. Thanks for watching.